Nevada, they go from the produce aisle to the slots to the ballot box. In California, they're doing it drive-through style. In Ohio, they arrive at the Board of Elections by the busload. They are the early voters. In our third story on the countdown, they are turning out in droves, some waiting in lines as long as 6 hours. In Georgia, one woman collapsed in line. 32 states now allowing residents to vote early without a special reason. In 2004, 22% of the electorate did that. This year, a third expected to take that advantage. Good news for the party whose mission has been get out the vote. Dubious, however, for Republicans trying, and in most cases failing, to suppress early voting and keep Democrats away from the polls on Tuesday, especially in the key swing states. Though in one rare case, a Republican has done the truly small d Democratic thing. Florida Governor Charlie Crist, as you've heard, extended early voting there from 8 hours to 12 per day. Let's turn now to MSNBC's own David Schuster. As usual, following an election we are, in a sense, joining already in progress. Good evening, David.
Good evening, Keith.
Well, first of all, the early voting numbers are astonishing. What's the accepted explanation for that turnout?
Well, three major factors, Keith. First of all, organization, convenience, and then fear. And as far as organization is concerned, both campaigns have put much more of an emphasis on early voting, and that's particularly the case with the Obama campaign, which sort of uses it as a way to keep track of precinct by precinct if they're getting their people out that they're supposed to. It's a lot easier if you do that over 2 weeks than as opposed to just, say, 12 hours on Election Day. As far as convenience is concerned, with all of the talk of historic nature and expected massive turnout on Election Day, a lot of people anecdotally simply would rather spend the 6 hours trying to wait in line now than worrying about what might happen on Tuesday. And then the other factor, Keith, is sort of fear, because there have been some changes in terms of requirements in many states, and because a lot of people remember Florida in 2000 or Ohio in 2004, there's a great fear among a lot of people anecdotally that they don't want to show up and suddenly realize maybe they need their ID and they don't have it. So if they show up now and there's a mistake or a problem, they can always fix the problem and then come back tomorrow. So those three factors pretty much driving the early voter turnout, according to most political analysts.
In the key states, David, Colorado, Florida, Iowa, North Carolina, Democrats outnumber Republicans among the early voters. Is there a conclusion to draw about proportions holding up like that on Tuesday?
Well, certainly with North Carolina and Iowa, the Democrats are outnumbering the Republicans in early voting by 2-1, and that certainly backs up the idea that Obama is doing very well in terms of his get-out-the-vote organization in those states and was likely leading in those two states. In Colorado and Florida, it's a bit more complicated because the Democrats have the edge overall in early voting, but the edge is more pronounced in terms of the actual in-person early voting, whereas the Republicans have the edge in those two states, Colorado and Florida, in terms of absentees. And when you look at the ratio, it's usually about 60% now actual in-person early voting, 40% absentee ballots. And so, again, it's a little more complicated in those two states. And another reason why a lot of people, of course, are looking at what's the actual turnout going to be on Election Day in those two states.
The Republican intimidation tactics, suing to shut down the early voting centers, sending private investigators to the homes of people they suspect of fraud, the lawsuits challenging voter eligibility, while they don't necessarily expect to win, and in many cases they haven't won, is the goal really a sort of an ad hoc PR campaign designed to intimidate voters and still paint Democrats as corrupt?
Yeah, it's really twofold, Keith. First of all, there is the effort, of course, to try to keep a lot of voters away from voting, especially in urban areas, traditional Democratic precincts, by either suggesting, for example, to people who are poor, uneducated, oh, if you've bounced a check, you're going to get arrested on Election Day. That's not true, but that kind of effort does have the impact of keeping some people away from the polls and diminishing some turnout. But beside all of that, there's also, of course, Keith, at least according to some Republicans are willing to talk about it, this idea that if the Democrats are going to win, they're going to control, of course, Congress, and if Obama's going to win, the Republicans, a lot of them, don't want there to be a mandate. And the idea is, well, if Obama wins and it's close, it makes it easier for Republicans to argue, well, wait a second, the Democrats sort of won this unfairly, they don't have the mandate. If it had been a clean election, maybe there had been a different outcome. And the irony, of course, is if that's sort of a political tactic post-election, it's particularly ironic given the way that the Democrats after 2000, that didn't sort of keep them from saying, wait a second, we're going to essentially try to block everything that the Republicans try and do. And
last point, Charlie Crist, the Republican governor of Florida, once on the short list for the vice presidential nomination, the Republican Party, voting hours, extending them. He extended them. The motivations, he's just being a good governor?
Well, this is the second time he's actually put his finger in McCain's eye. You recall the first, of course, was regarding Acorn when Charlie Crist went off the talking points and said, oh, no, voter fraud's not a problem down here in Florida. Part of it is sort of simply driven by the fact, the political reality, that when you do see these pictures of people waiting for 6 hours or long lines in Florida, obviously that it makes it easier if they can extend the hours. But the other part is Florida. Clearly, Crist does not want to go through the same thing that Florida went through back in 2000. And the idea is if you can solve some of the problems now, lengthen the hours, perhaps that means Florida won't be the poster child of a bad election day as it was 8 years ago.
MSNBC's David Schuster. Thanks, David. Have a good night.
Thanks, Keith.